Welcome to the deep dive. Okay, today we're plunging into a really fascinating, maybe even kind of scary moment in human history. We're talking roughly 3,200 years ago.
hmm
It's this period where, almost out of nowhere, it seems, loads of really advanced, thriving civilizations just vanished across the Western world, basically.
Yeah, it's like a huge reset button got hit.
Yeah.
And the loss was just immense, not just for the people then, but, for us trying to understand it now.
Totally. We're talking writing systems gone, language is just wiped out. It's almost hard to wrap your head around, isn't it?
It really is. And for this deep dive, we've been looking at the source material you mentioned, including that transcript from the Timeline documentary, the one called Why So Many Ancient Civilizations Collapsed at the Same Time.
Right.
And it paints a really vivid picture of this dramatic turning point. It's been a genuine mystery for historians for, well, ages.
Absolutely. So our mission today really is to try and unpack this whole Bronze Age collapse. We want to get into how connected these societies actually were and look at this surprising role climate change seems to have played, which kind of moves us beyond the older ideas, right? The ones just about invaders.
Exactly. And we're drawing a lot on the work of Eric Klein here, who's, a major figure, a leading authority on this whole late Bronze Age period.
In that late Bronze Age itself, it's fascinating. This is when you've got these big kingdoms, powerful empires.
Yeah, a really flourishing time. Some people even put things like the Exodus or the Trojan War, if they happened around this time.
Right, that context is important.
But what's really striking, and Klein really emphasizes this, is just how fast it all seems to have happened.
Yeah.
We're talking maybe a generation or two.
Yeah.
Everything they knew, this stability they'd had for centuries, it just disintegrated.
Wow, can you imagine that? Such a rapid, widespread breakdown.
It's quite something to think about.
And it's this puzzle, isn't it? Trying to figure out what caused it all. Researchers have been on this quest for like over a century.
They really have. And what's so interesting, I think, is how our understanding has shifted, especially recently, as new kinds of evidence have come in.
Yeah, tell us about that.
Well, for the longest time, you had sort of historians doing their thing, archaeologists digging stuff up, geologists looking at rocks, climate scientists studying ice cores or whatever.
Yeah.
But they weren't really talking to each other much.
Right, working in silos.
Exactly. They were all looking at bits of the puzzle, but separately.
Uh-huh.
And the big breakthrough, the real paradigm shift that the video transcript highlights, was realizing these fields needed to connect, needed to share what they were finding.
Ah, okay.
And that collision, that interdisciplinary approach, it's just opened up completely new ways of seeing what might have happened back then.
Okay, so let's start unpacking that. Where did the first clues come from? You mentioned Egypt survived this period, relatively speaking.
That's right. Egypt is key, especially early on. Because they kept writing things down, their inscriptions give us some of the first contemporary glimpses of the chaos unfolding elsewhere.
So like specific records.
Yeah, especially during the reign of Ramses III. His big temple complex at Medinet Habu down in Thebes. It's covered in reliefs and texts that talk about war, invasions, real first-hand accounts from the time.
And what do these inscriptions actually describe? I know they mention the sea peoples.
They do. They paint this picture of, well, marauders,
Yeah.
basically, coming by sea, sometimes overland too, laying waste to establish kingdoms like the Hittites, Cyprus, places along the coast, and then heading straight for Egypt.
So it sounds pretty dramatic in the inscriptions.
Oh, absolutely. Very dramatic. And it's crucial to remember Egypt wasn't just, watching this happen from afar. The inscriptions make it clear they were being invaded too. Ramses claims these big victories, but it shows how widespread the whole crisis was. It was hitting the entire region.
And who else was around at that time? This network you mentioned.
Right? It was a really interconnected world back then, the late Bronze Age.
Yeah.
You had the big powers like the Babylonians and Assyrians over in Mesopotamia, modern Iraq. Then along the Levantine coast, you had Canaan, lots of city-states.
Yeah.
Central Turkey was the heartland of the Hittite Empire, a major player.
Okay.
Coastal Turkey had various kingdoms, maybe including Troy, if the stories have a basis in fact.
Yeah.
Then mainland Greece had the Mycenaean civilization, Agamemnon and all that. And Egypt was arguably the superpower, the big anchor in the south.
Wow, quite a neighborhood. And Egypt itself, relied heavily on the Nile, right, for centuries.
Absolutely. Its whole civilization was built around the Nile's predictable flooding. The transcript even touches on this idea that, going way back, the Sahara drying out might have pushed people toward the Nile Valley in the first place.
That makes sense. Long-term climate-driving settlement patterns.
Yeah, it's a reminder that climate shifts, even really ancient ones, have always shaped human history. That gradual desertification over millennia
Definitely concentrated populations near the river.
So back to those early archaeologists, the Victorians maybe, deciphering Ramses' temple walls. They see these dramatic pictures of invaders, the sea peoples,
Right.
and they understandably jump to the conclusion, aha, these guys caused the collapse. The classic barbarians at the gates idea.
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, the inscriptions are vivid. They show battles, ships, people clearly identified as foreign enemies. Ramses is boasting about defeating them. So if you're looking for a simple explanation for widespread destruction, well, there it is, carved in stone.
Makes sense why they'd think that initially.
It does. It was the most direct evidence they had at the time.
But as we're finding out, the thinking has shifted quite a bit now, hasn't it? It's not really seen as just one big invasion force anymore.
Not really. Modern thinking, with, a century more digging and all this new climate science coming in, it suggests the sea peoples were more likely a symptom of the crisis, not the sole cause.
A symptom? How so?
Well, the idea is that they were probably part of a larger, much more complex breakdown. Maybe displaced people themselves, caught up in the chaos. They definitely contributed to the disruption, no doubt about it. But the focus now is more on the underlying vulnerabilities that made these powerful kingdoms fall apart so quickly.
Right, which brings us back to how interconnected everything was. It wasn't just like random kingdoms falling over one by one.
Not at all. This wasn't just coincidence. These places were deeply linked. Despite, the occasional war, there was tons of trade, diplomacy. We find letters between kings written on clay tablets, detailed lists of goods being exchanged, formal treaties. It was a proper international system.
Like a Bronze Age global network.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
In their known world, absolutely. And the archaeology backs this up completely. You find similar stuff everywhere.
Like what sort of stuff?
Well, the transcript mentions finding similar styles of pottery, tools, luxury goods. Even things like copper ingots, often in a distinctive oxhide shape, turning up in shipwrecks and at sites all over the place. From Megiddo in Canaan to Hattusa, the Hittite capital, Mycenaeans in Greece, Knossos on Crete, Thebes in Egypt, Ugarit on the Syrian coast.
So these shared objects, what do they tell us? Just trade?
Trade, definitely, but maybe more. It suggests shared technologies, maybe even shared ideas about status or culture moving around. Those copper ingots, for example, having a standard shape, might mean they came from a common source, probably Cyprus, or were part of a really organized trading system.
And copper was vital, right? For bronze.
Absolutely essential. Bronze is copper plus tin. And the transcript notes copper mostly came from Cyprus. The names Cyprus and copper are related, actually.
Oh, interesting.
But tin, that was the rarer ingredient. And the best guess is that much of it came all the way from Afghanistan.
Afghanistan. Wow, that's incredibly far for that time.
It is. It just highlights how complex and surprisingly long distance these trade networks were. Think about it like our modern supply chains. If one crucial part breaks down, say the tin supply gets disrupted because of trouble along the route, then everyone who needs bronze suddenly has a massive problem. Weapons, tools, art.
It paints a picture of a system that's maybe more fragile than it looked.
Exactly. Very interconnected, very sophisticated, but maybe vulnerable if key nodes were hit. And when it did unravel, the results were just devastating. Take the Hittite Empire, a huge power, gone. Vanished so completely, people weren't even sure where its capital city, Hattusa, was until archaeologists found it in the 20th century.
An entire empire just lost to memory for centuries. That's staggering.
It really shows the scale of the collapse.
Yeah.
And yeah, people had proposed other ideas before the climate evidence being strong, maybe swarms of earthquakes, big changes in warfare, making old defenses obsolete, localized famines.
But those things had happened before, right?
Precisely. Civilizations had faced earthquakes, wars, even famines before, and usually recovered. This time felt different. It was widespread, simultaneous, and permanent for many of these places. Something bigger seemed to be going on.
Okay, so this is where the climate science really comes into play. The evidence for a massive drought.
Yes, this has been the real game changer in the last couple of decades, especially the work on ancient pollen, palynology.
Right, you mentioned that earlier, pollen from lake beds.
Exactly. Daphne Langett's research, mentioned in the transcript, looking at sediment cores from the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee and the Levant. What they found was compelling.
What did they find?
Around the time of the Bronze Age collapse, say 1250 down to 1100 BCE, they saw a significant drop in the lake levels. But crucially, they also saw a major decrease, almost a disappearance in some layers, of pollen from trees like olives and oaks.
Ah, so fewer trees means.
Drier conditions, much drier. Trees need water. If the tree pollen vanishes, it strongly suggests a shift to a much more arid climate.
Wow. And does that match up with the archaeology, like cities being destroyed?
It lines up remarkably well. Israel Finkelstein, another key archaeologist, pointed out that this period of intense drought coincides precisely with the time when numerous Bronze Age cities across Canaan were destroyed and abandoned. It suddenly made sense of that widespread destruction layer archaeologists had been finding for years.
So the pieces start fitting together.
Exactly. There's that anecdote in the transcript about Eric Klein basically having his book manuscript ready to go to the publisher, just as this really solid climate data started emerging. He had to scramble to get it in.
Huh. Talk about timing.
Right. It just shows how fast things can move when different fields start talking. Science suddenly provided a potential underlying cause for the chaos historians and archaeologists were seeing.
And was this drought just in the Levant, or was it wider?
It seems to have been much wider. Similar evidence for drought around the same time has turned up in lake sediments from Lake Van in Turkey, in parts of Syria. It looks like a large-scale Mediterranean event.
Which would hit everyone in that interconnected network we talked about.
Absolutely. Lee Drake's point in the transcript is crucial here. Mediterranean agriculture is overwhelmingly rain-fed. Unlike Egypt with the Nile, most places depend directly on winter rains.
Right?
So if you get a prolonged severe drought hitting multiple kingdoms at the same time, their grain stores run out, there's no surplus to trade or buffer bad years, you get famine, unrest, people start moving, society starts to break down.
Okay, so a massive drought seems like a major factor. But what caused the drought? Why did it suddenly get so dry across such a large area?
Well, this is where the climate scientists come in again. Their theory, based on analyzing tiny fossils like plankton shells in seabed cores from the Mediterranean.
Seabed cores, okay?
Yeah, they noticed a change in the types of plankton species living in the sea around this time. And these changes suggest the sea surface temperatures suddenly got colder.
Colder seas. How does that lead to drought?
It's a chain reaction, basically. Colder sea surface, less evaporation from the sea, less moisture in the atmosphere, less rainfall over land, especially during the winter rainy season, which is critical for the Med.
Ah, okay. Less evaporation, less rain. Makes sense.
So that leads to poor harvests year after year, and hungry people living in increasingly unstable societies.
And what might have triggered that initial sea cooling? Did they have ideas about that?
The transcript mentions a couple of possibilities climate scientists have floated. Maybe increased meltwater from glaciers in the Alps, changing ocean currents. Or perhaps shifts in atmospheric patterns, bringing colder air down from Siberia more persistently. It's complex, but the idea is some larger climate system shift cooled the Med.
It's a reminder, isn't it, how interconnected these Earth systems are? Changes far away can have huge impacts locally.
Absolutely, even back then. Now, while they had this sea temperature data for the wider Med, there was a bit of a gap for Greece itself,
Yeah.
the heartland of the Mycenaeans.
Right, did they find evidence there too?
Yes, and this was another key piece of the puzzle. Martin Finn's research, using stalagmites from a cave in southern Greece.
Stalagmites. How do they record climate? That sounds cool.
It is pretty cool. Stalagmites, grow upwards from the cave floor as water drips down.
Yeah.
Each drop leaves behind tiny mineral deposits, calcite usually.
Mm.
Over centuries, millennia, these build up in layers like tree rings.
Okay.
And the rate they grow depends partly on how much water is dripping, so rainfall. And the chemical makeup of each layer, things like oxygen isotopes, can also tell you about temperature and rainfall patterns. They can date these layers very precisely using uranium-thorium dating.
Wow. So what did Finn find in the Greek cave stalagmites?
His analysis showed a really significant period, about 200 years leading up to the collapse period, where rainfall was clearly declining. And then, crucially, there was a long stretch, coinciding with the main collapse era, where the stalagmite basically stopped growing altogether for a while.
Stopped growing, meaning...
Meaning it got really dry. Probably a severe, prolonged drought, much worse than anything before it in that record.
And Greece is definitely rain-fed agriculture like the rest of the Med.
Exactly. And this intense drought period lines up perfectly with the time archaeologists see widespread destruction and abandonment of the major Mycenaean centers, places like Pylos, which happens to be quite near the cave Finn studied.
So another strong link between climate change, specifically drought, and the collapse of a major civilization.
A very compelling link, yeah. It really adds weight to the idea that drought wasn't just a local issue, but a major driver across the region.
Okay, so we have widespread drought hitting Mycenaean Greece, the Levant, Anatolia. But Egypt, you said, seemed to endure longer. How? Weren't they affected by the same climate shifts?
That's a really interesting part of the story. Egypt did seem more resilient at first glance anyway. They had the Nile, which offers a buffer against rainfall variations, although not perfectly. And the transcript mentions their stronghold in Canaan Megiddo. It's in the Jezreel Valley, which is a relatively fertile area. There's some evidence they might have been actively trying to boost food production there, maybe aware of the growing problems elsewhere.
What kind of things?
Well, suggestions include intensifying agriculture, maybe using more cattle for plowing. There's even DNA evidence suggesting the introduction of zebu cattle around this time.
Zebu, aren't they more adapted to, like, drier, hotter climates?
Exactly. More resilient to climate stress than the local breeds. So, bringing them in could have been a deliberate strategy to cope. Maybe they were also extending dry farming techniques. The idea is perhaps Egypt was trying to use Canaan, especially the Jezreel Valley, as a breadbasket to supply grain to other parts of its empire that were struggling.
So Ramses III wasn't just fighting sea peoples, he was maybe fighting famine too, trying to hold his territories together.
That seems very likely. He was probably dealing with multiple crises, simultaneously external threats and internal pressures caused by resource scarcity.
But there's always a but, isn't there? Was Egypt completely immune?
Well, no, and this is crucial. Mark Macklin's research, looking at Nile River sediments, throws a wrench in the works for the idea of Egypt sailing through untouched.
What did the sediments show?
His work suggests that around this same period, the Nile itself experienced major problems, specifically a significant channel contraction and the river shrinking and reduced flooding.
Oh, that's bad news for Egyptian agriculture, surely. The floods were everything.
Absolutely devastating. Reduced floods mean less fertile silt deposited on the fields and less water available for irrigation. So even Egypt's lifeline was likely under threat.
And does that fit with anything else we know about Ramses III's reign?
It actually fits perfectly with evidence of growing internal problems. The transcript mentions the first ever recorded labor strike and history workers building royal tombs down tools because they hadn't been paid, likely because the state granaries were low.
Wow, a strike 3,000 years ago.
Yeah. And you also start seeing the first real evidence of systematic tomb robbery around this time. Desperate people breaking into the tombs of previous pharaohs looking for wealth. These aren't signs of a stable, prosperous kingdom. It points to significant hardship, even in Egypt.
So even the mighty Egypt was feeling the pinch badly.
It certainly seems so. More resilient, perhaps, but definitely not immune to the crisis.
This really changes the perspective on the sea peoples again, doesn't it? If everyone, including Egypt, is struggling with drought and famine.
It really does. Israel Finkelstein's revised view makes a lot more sense in this context. He argues against seeing the Sea Peoples as some kind of unified naval invasion, like, D-Day or something.
Right.
Instead, he suggests thinking about them as perhaps fragmented groups, maybe migrants or refugees, displaced by the droughts and collapsing societies in their own homelands, possibly Aegean, Anatolian, maybe even parts of the Levant.
So people on the move looking for survival, not necessarily conquest.
Maybe a mix. Desperate people can be dangerous. But the primary driver might have been push factors, famine, chaos back home, and pull factors seeking land, food, any kind of stability elsewhere. You could maybe draw a loose parallel to modern refugee movements driven by conflict or environmental disaster.
That feels very different from the old barbarian hordes idea.
Completely different. It makes them part of the tragedy, not just the cause of it.
And those archaeological finds at Megiddo, that Egyptian stronghold we mentioned, the transcript described the city gate.
Yeah, the findings there are incredibly evocative. The final phase of the late Bronze Age city shows the Grand Palace and the city gate complex were destroyed by fire. But within the gateway area, before the final destruction, archaeologists found simple ovens built, crammed into the space.
Ovens in the city gate. Why?
It suggests the city was overcrowded, possibly under siege or full of refugees seeking safety within the walls. People were living and cooking in spaces not meant for habitation. It's a really powerful, almost symbolic image of civilization breaking down, the gateway becoming a place of refuge and desperation before being utterly destroyed.
A grim picture of the end.
Very grim.
And even Ramses III, despite his victories against the Sea Peoples and his efforts to manage the crisis, it didn't end well for him personally, did it? The harem conspiracy.
That's right. Towards the end of his long reign, there was a plot involving one of his wives and numerous officials to assassinate him and put her son on the throne. While the plot was uncovered and the conspirators punished, the fact it happened at all suggests significant instability and discontent
right at the heart of the Egyptian court.
Maybe linked to the wider pressures and hardships the kingdom was facing?
It's certainly plausible. Times of crisis often breed internal conflict and challenges to authority. It could well be another symptom of the immense strain Egypt was under.
And after all this, Ramses III dies, Egypt weakens, the Mycenaeans are gone, the Hittites vanished. What follows is this dark age.
Yes, that's the term often used. A period lasting centuries in many areas, especially Greece and Anatolia, where urban centers collapsed, populations declined drastically, long-distance trade dried up, and crucially, literacy was lost. Writing systems like Mycenaean Linear B just disappeared.
Lost writing. That's huge.
It's a massive break. Languages vanished. Traditions were broken. It really was like hitting reset. And it took a long, long time for complex societies and new forms of political organization to reemerge in many of these regions.
It's quite humbling, isn't it? The transcript calls it an uncomfortable truth. This idea that natural forces, maybe just a few degrees change in sea temperature leading to less rain, can bring down these incredibly complex, powerful human civilizations.
It really is humbling. It challenges our sense, perhaps our modern arrogance, about being fully in control of our destiny, separate from the environment. History shows we're deeply intertwined with these natural systems.
And it makes looking at this period feel incredibly relevant today with our own focus on climate change.
Absolutely. Understanding how past societies responded or failed to respond to significant climate shifts offers potential lessons or at least points for reflection about our own vulnerabilities and the importance of resilience and adaptation. The past isn't just the past. It informs the present.
And of course, history didn't end there. The Bronze Age collapsed, but eventually things changed again. The transcript mentions the Iron Age rising from the ashes.
Indeed. A new technological era, new peoples, new empires eventually emerged, like the Assyrians, the Phoenicians, the early Greeks. But that, as you say, is probably a whole other deep dive.
Definitely sounds like it. So just to wrap up our dive today, the key takeaways seem to be, first, just how interconnected these Bronze Age societies were.
Yeah, that interconnectedness was both their strength and perhaps their fatal weakness when crisis hit.
And second, the really powerful evidence now pointing to climate change, specifically a prolonged, widespread drought as a major, maybe even the primary, trigger for the collapse, likely caused by that cooling of the Mediterranean Sea.
Right. The science has really shifted the narrative on that.
Which leads to the third point. Rethinking the sea peoples, not as the soul destroyers, but more likely as groups caught up in and contributing to the chaos driven by that environmental crisis.
Exactly. More symptom than cause, or at least a complex mix.
And that aha moment you mentioned earlier, it really feels like it comes from bringing all these different fields together, doesn't it? History, archaeology, climate science.
That's the crucial thing, I think. It's the synergy between the disciplines. Reading the text, digging up the cities, and analyzing the pollen and the stalagmites. That combination gives us a much richer, more plausible picture than any single field could alone.
It really makes you think about fragility, doesn't it? How these complex systems we build can be vulnerable to things we don't always see coming.
It does. And it makes you wonder. Our own world is more interconnected than ever before, technologically complex, and facing undeniable climate challenges.
So the final thought to maybe leave people with, given what happened back then, the role of interconnectedness in spreading the collapse, the impact of climate, are there parallels or maybe warnings for us today?
That's the uncomfortable but maybe necessary question, isn't it? What lessons can this ancient catastrophe offer our modern, globalized world? It's definitely something worth pondering long after this conversation ends.
Absolutely. And if folks want to dig deeper, exploring that dark age itself or looking into how the Iron Age societies rose up afterwards, there's so much more there.
A whole world of history waiting.
Well, this has been fascinating. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.